The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete walkway as Elena Vasquez pulled her weathered sedan into the parking space at Marine Corps Base Quantico. The civilian shooting range operated on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a small concession that allowed local residents to use the facilities during off-peak hours. She preferred these quiet sessions, away from the intense energy that military personnel brought to the range during their training periods. Elena stepped out of her car, adjusting the loose cotton jacket that concealed the lightweight rifle case slung across her shoulder. At 43, she had learned to appreciate anonymity. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her worn jeans and faded sneakers marked her clearly as a civilian among the precision and polish that typically dominated this space. The range master, Sergeant First Class Marcus Torres, glanced up from his paperwork as she approached the check-in window. He had grown accustomed to Elena's twice-monthly visits over the past year, though she rarely engaged in conversation beyond the necessary pleasantries. "Good morning, ma'am," Torres said, sliding the sign-in sheet across the counter. "Lane preference today. Anything toward the end would be fine," Elena replied, her voice carrying the slightest trace of a Southwest accent. She signed her name with practiced efficiency, noting that only 2 other civilians had checked in before her arrival. Torres handed her safety glasses and hearing protection, along with the standard range rules reminder card that she had memorized months ago. The morning air carried the familiar scent of gun oil and the distant sound of groundskeeping equipment, maintaining the base's immaculate appearance. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've seen situations like this at ranges in your area. Elena made her way through the entrance doors, her footsteps echoing softly in the concrete corridor that led to the rifle range. The building itself was utilitarian, designed for function rather than comfort, with fluorescent lighting that created sharp contrasts between light and shadow. She had always found something oddly comforting about spaces like this, where purpose took precedence over decoration. The range stretched out before her, 25 individual shooting lanes separated by chest-high dividers. Most remained empty at this early hour, save for an elderly man at lane 3 methodically working through what appeared to be sight adjustments on a vintage hunting rifle, and a young woman at lane 7 who seemed to be struggling with her stance. Elena selected lane 22, appreciating its position at the far end, where she could focus without distraction. She set her rifle case on the bench and began the familiar ritual of preparation. Her movements were economical, each action flowing naturally into the next as she assembled her equipment with the kind of muscle memory that spoke of countless repetitions. Elena had just finished loading her first magazine when the sound of heavy boots echoed through the range corridor. The measured cadence was unmistakably military, carrying an authority that seemed to announce itself before its owner appeared. She glanced toward the entrance and felt her stomach tighten as a figure emerged from the shadows of the doorway. Colonel Harrison Burke stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, his dress uniform pressed to perfection despite the early hour. His silver eagles caught the fluorescent light as he surveyed the range with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to finding fault. At 51, Burke had built his career on exacting standards and zero tolerance for mediocrity, qualities that had earned him both respect and fear among his subordinates. "What brings you here during civilian hours, Colonel?" Torres asked, straightening instinctively behind his desk. "Unscheduled inspection," Burke replied, his voice carrying the crisp tone of someone who expected immediate compliance. "I want to observe how our facilities are being utilized during off-peak periods. Standards must be maintained regardless of who is using our equipment." Elena focused intently on her rifle setup, hoping to avoid notice. She had learned long ago that military officers during their working hours operated in a different world than the one she now inhabited. Her hands moved steadily as she adjusted her scope, though she could feel Burke's presence like a weight pressing against her concentration. Burke began his methodical examination of the range, noting the condition of each lane, the placement of safety equipment, and the behavior of the few civilians present. His polished dress shoes clicked against the concrete floor as he moved from position to position, occasionally making notes on a small pad he carried. When he reached the elderly gentleman at lane 3, Burke paused to observe the man's shooting form. The civilian was using a classic bolt-action rifle, his technique showing the careful precision of someone who had learned to shoot in an era when ammunition was expensive and every shot mattered. Adequate fundamentals. Burke commented to no one in particular, though his tone suggested that adequate fell far short of impressive. The young woman at lane 7 drew more of Burke's attention, primarily because her stance revealed obvious inexperience. She held her rifle too tightly, her shoulder position creating unnecessary tension that would inevitably affect her accuracy. Burke watched her fire several rounds, each shot accompanied by an exaggerated flinch that spoke of poor training or lack thereof. "Ma'am," Burke called out, causing the woman to lower her rifle and turn toward him with obvious nervousness. "Your grip is compromising your stability." Military personnel receive proper instruction to prevent such fundamental errors. The woman nodded quickly, clearly intimidated by Burke's authoritative presence. She attempted to adjust her position, but her movements remained tentative and uncertain. Elena continued her preparations, checking her ammunition and verifying her safety equipment while keeping Burke in her peripheral vision. She had developed an instinct for reading military officers, understanding when their attention might turn in her direction and how to minimize her presence during such encounters. Burke completed his examination of the first half of the range and began moving toward Elena's end. His pace remained measured, but she noticed how his eyes seemed to catalog every detail, from the condition of the lane dividers to the placement of spent brass on the concrete floor. The distance between them diminished with each step, and Elena found herself unconsciously adjusting her posture. Years of civilian life had not entirely erased the reflexive responses that military environments could trigger. She focused on her breathing, maintaining the calm exterior that had served her well in countless similar situations. Burke paused at lane 20, examining the equipment left behind by a previous user. He made another note, his expression suggesting mild disapproval at some minor detail that had escaped Elena's notice. As he approached her position at lane 22, Elena felt the familiar tension that came with unwanted scrutiny. She continued her methodical preparation, hoping that her obvious competence with her equipment might earn her the same brief acknowledgement Burke had given the elderly gentleman. Burke reached lane 22 and stopped directly behind Elena's position. She could feel his presence like a shadow falling across her workspace, though she continued her preparations without acknowledging his proximity. Her rifle lay across the bench, a well-maintained but unremarkable hunting model that showed signs of regular use without ostentation. "Interesting setup," Burke observed, his tone carrying the neutral quality that experienced military personnel used when gathering information. Elena recognized the sound of an officer preparing to render judgment. She nodded politely, but continued checking her scope adjustments. The morning light streaming through the range windows created a pattern of brightness and shadow that reminded her of other places, other times when precise shooting had mattered for reasons far more serious than recreational accuracy. Burke moved to her left side, positioning himself where he could observe her technique once she began firing. Elena felt her jaw tighten slightly, but maintained her outward composure. She had encountered countless officers during her lifetime, each convinced that their perspective carried unique authority. "Your stance preparation is unconventional," Burke said, watching as Elena positioned herself behind her rifle. She had developed a modified shooting position over the years, one that accommodated old injuries while maintaining the precision she required. To an uninformed observer, it might appear awkward or inefficient. Elena settled into her firing position, her left shoulder angled slightly forward and her right leg positioned further back than standard training manuals typically recommended. The adjustment felt natural to her, a necessary adaptation that had become second nature over years of practice. "Most civilian shooters benefit from proper military instruction," Burke continued, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone accustomed to correcting fundamental errors. The fundamentals we teach exist for proven reasons. She aligned her sight picture and took a controlled breath, preparing for her first shot of the morning. The target downrange stood at 100 yards, a standard paper bullseye that would provide adequate feedback for her practice session. That position will compromise your accuracy, Burke stated with growing confidence. Your support arm angle creates unnecessary muscular tension that will affect your natural point of aim. Elena paused, her finger resting alongside the trigger guard rather than on the trigger itself. She turned her head slightly to acknowledge Burke's presence without fully engaging in conversation. "I appreciate your concern," she said quietly, her voice carrying a politeness that masked growing discomfort. "I have some old injuries that require this adjustment." Burke's expression shifted to one of barely concealed skepticism. He had heard countless excuses from struggling shooters over the years, most of them designed to deflect responsibility for poor performance rather than address fundamental technique problems. "Injuries," he repeated, his tone suggesting that he found such explanations convenient rather than credible. "Most shooting difficulties stem from improper training rather than physical limitations. The human body adapts remarkably well to correct form when properly instructed." Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks, but maintained her controlled demeanor. She had learned to avoid confrontations with authority figures, understanding that such encounters rarely ended favorably for civilians challenging military personnel on their own territory. "I understand your point," she replied, returning her attention to her rifle. "I will keep your suggestions in mind." Burke remained in position, clearly expecting to observe her shooting performance and provide additional correction as necessary. His presence created a weight that seemed to press against Elena's concentration, transforming what should have been a peaceful morning practice session into an uncomfortable evaluation. The elderly gentleman at Lane 3 had stopped shooting and was now observing the interaction with obvious curiosity. The young woman at Lane 7 had also paused, her attention divided between her own struggles and the drama unfolding at the far end of the range. Elena closed her eyes briefly, centering herself despite the unwanted scrutiny. When she opened them again, her sight picture remained steady, the crosshairs aligned precisely with the center of the distant target. Proper instruction could eliminate the need for such compensations, Burke added, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Military standards exist because they produce consistent results regardless of individual preferences or perceived limitations. Elena's finger moved to the trigger, applying the steady pressure that would send her first round downrange. She had faced more intimidating situations than this, though the familiar tension of being judged and found wanting brought back memories she preferred to keep buried. Elena squeezed the trigger with practiced control, the rifle's report echoing through the enclosed range. The bullet struck the target with a solid thump, and through her scope she could see the hole appear dead center in the bullseye. She worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent casing and chambering another round. Burke stepped closer to the spotting scope mounted on the lane divider, adjusting the focus to examine her shot placement. His eyebrows raised slightly at what he observed, though his expression quickly returned to its previous skeptical state. "Acceptable shot," he conceded, though his tone suggested that one accurate round proved nothing significant. Beginner's luck often produces isolated good results before fundamental flaws become apparent. Elena fired her second shot, again finding the center of the target with precision that seemed effortless. The rhythm felt natural to her, each shot flowing seamlessly into the preparation for the next. Burke continued his observation through the spotting scope, his silence growing more pronounced with each successive shot. By her fifth round, Elena had created a tight grouping in the target's center ring, each bullet hole overlapping with its neighbors in a pattern that spoke of exceptional consistency. Burke straightened from the spotting scope, his professional composure showing the first cracks of uncertainty. "Your technique remains fundamentally flawed," he stated, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Those compensations you are making will fail under pressure or at extended distances." Elena paused in her shooting rhythm, finally turning to face Burke directly. She could see the confusion in his eyes, the struggle between what his experience told him should happen and what was actually occurring downrange. "I understand your concerns about my form," she said, her voice maintaining its respectful tone despite the growing tension. "These adjustments work for my particular situation." Burke's jaw tightened visibly. He had built his career on the premise that proper military training produced superior results, and Elena's performance was challenging that fundamental belief. The other shooters on the range had stopped their own practice to observe the exchange, sensing the escalating conflict. Sergeant Torres approached from his position at the check-in desk, drawn by the unusual tension that had settled over the normally peaceful civilian session. He had witnessed countless interactions between military personnel and civilian shooters, but rarely had he seen a colonel invest so much attention in correcting a recreational shooter's technique. "Is everything proceeding smoothly?" Colonel Torres asked, his tone carefully neutral while offering Burke an opportunity to disengage from a situation. "I am providing instruction to improve this civilian's shooting fundamentals," Burke replied, his voice carrying the edge of someone whose authority had been quietly questioned. "Her current technique violates basic principles that any competent instructor would correct immediately." Elena felt the weight of multiple gazes focused on her position. What had begun as a private practice session had transformed into a public examination of her shooting ability, with Burke positioned as the expert evaluator and herself cast as the struggling amateur in need of correction. "Colonel, perhaps we could discuss this after the lady finishes her practice session," Torres suggested diplomatically, recognizing the potential for an uncomfortable escalation. "This is precisely when correction should occur," Burke responded firmly. "Allowing improper technique to continue only reinforces bad habits that become increasingly difficult to eliminate over time." Elena returned to her shooting position, though the peaceful focus she had enjoyed earlier had evaporated completely. Every movement now felt scrutinized, every breath measured against Burke's expectations of proper form. She aligned her sight picture once again, finding the familiar comfort of precise aim despite the uncomfortable circumstances. The target downrange remained unchanged, offering the same challenge it had presented when her morning practice began in blessed solitude. "Your breathing pattern is irregular," Burke observed, moving to a position where he could monitor her technique more closely. "Proper respiratory control is fundamental to consistent accuracy." Elena exhaled slowly, centering herself as she had learned to do in far more challenging circumstances than this. The crosshairs settled naturally on the target center, and she applied pressure to the trigger with the same steady control she had maintained throughout her shooting sequence. The sixth shot joined its predecessors in the target's center ring, maintaining the tight grouping that had initially surprised Burke and was now actively challenging his assessment of her abilities. Burke's frustration became increasingly visible as Elena continued her shooting sequence. Each round struck the target with mechanical precision, creating a cluster that would have impressed even his most accomplished marksman. Yet her unconventional stance and modified technique contradicted everything he believed about proper shooting fundamentals. "Ma'am, I must insist that you allow me to demonstrate correct firing position," Burke announced, his voice carrying the authority of rank and decades of military instruction. "Your current method may produce isolated good results, but it lacks the consistency required for serious marksmanship." Elena paused with her rifle still shouldered, looking downrange at her target through the scope. 7 shots had created a group smaller than a quarter, each bullet hole touching its neighbors in a display of accuracy that spoke of exceptional skill rather than lucky accident. "Colonel, I appreciate your offer," she replied carefully, maintaining the respectful tone that had served her throughout this increasingly uncomfortable encounter. "I have been shooting this way for quite some time and have found it effective for my needs." The elderly gentleman at lane 3 had abandoned any pretense of continuing his own practice, instead watching the drama unfold with obvious fascination. The young woman at lane 7 stood behind her firing position, her earlier nervousness replaced by curious observation of the exchange between the confident military officer and the quietly determined civilian woman. "Your needs," Burke repeated, his tone suggesting that civilian recreational shooting hardly constituted serious marksmanship requirements. Military precision demands adherence to proven techniques that function under combat conditions, not accommodations for perceived comfort preferences. Elena felt her patience beginning to fray at the edges, though she maintained her outward composure. She had encountered this type of condescending instruction before, the assumption that her experience meant nothing compared to textbook knowledge and military credentials. Torres approached their position again, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension that was disrupting the normally peaceful atmosphere of civilian range time. He had observed Burke's increasing agitation and recognized the signs of an officer whose authority was being challenged in ways he had not anticipated. "Colonel, perhaps we might consider that different shooters sometimes develop effective techniques through experience," Torres suggested diplomatically, trying to provide Burke with a face-saving exit from the confrontation. "Sergeant, proper instruction exists to prevent civilians from developing inefficient habits that masquerade as personal techniques," Burke responded sharply, his irritation now directed toward Torres as well as Elena. "Military standards represent the culmination of extensive research and battlefield testing." Elena lowered her rifle and turned to face Burke directly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She could see the rigid certainty in his expression, the absolute conviction that his knowledge superseded any evidence to the contrary. "Colonel Burke," she said, using his rank in an attempt to maintain the respect that military protocol demanded, "I understand your position, but I must respectfully continue with my current technique. It accommodates certain physical limitations that standard positions do not address effectively." "Physical limitations," Burke scoffed, his skepticism now openly displayed. "The military successfully trains personnel with various physical challenges to achieve exceptional marksmanship through proper adaptation of standard techniques. Your modifications represent avoidance rather than legitimate accommodation." The harshness of his words created a palpable silence throughout the range. Even the distant sounds of base maintenance seemed to pause, as if the morning itself was holding its breath in anticipation of Elena's response. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with her shooting stance and everything to do with the casual dismissal of experiences that Burke could not possibly understand. Her left hand moved unconsciously toward her shoulder, where old scars lay hidden beneath her loose cotton jacket. "I assure you, Colonel, that my limitations are quite real," she said, her voice remaining steady despite the growing tension she felt. "They are not matters of convenience or preference." Burke stepped closer, his imposing presence designed to emphasize his authority and Elena's civilian status. The gap between them narrowed to less than arm's length, creating an intimidation dynamic that he had used effectively countless times throughout his military career. "Then perhaps you would benefit from observing proper technique demonstrated by someone with actual credentials," he declared, reaching toward Elena's rifle with the expectation that she would immediately defer to his superior knowledge and experience. Elena instinctively pulled her rifle back from Burke's reaching hand, the movement automatic and protective. The gesture sparked something dangerous in Burke's expression, transforming his professional condescension into personal affront at what he perceived as defiance of his authority. "Ma'am, I'm offering to provide you with proper instruction," Burke stated, his voice carrying the hard edge of command that brooked no argument. "Your resistance to correction suggests an attitude problem that compounds your technical deficiencies." The atmosphere on the range had shifted dramatically from the peaceful morning practice session Elena had anticipated. Torres stood nearby, clearly torn between his duty to maintain order and his reluctance to escalate a confrontation with a superior officer. The other civilian shooters had completely abandoned their own activities, drawn by the increasingly heated exchange. "Colonel, I am not resisting instruction," Elena replied, her voice remaining controlled despite the growing pressure she felt. I am simply explaining that my current technique addresses specific physical requirements that standard positions cannot accommodate. Burke's patience, already strained by Elena's unexpected accuracy and unwillingness to defer to his expertise, finally snapped completely. He had built his reputation on the premise that military training produced superior results, and Elena's performance challenged that fundamental belief in ways that he found professionally threatening. "Your excuses are becoming tiresome," he declared loudly enough for everyone on the range to hear clearly. "Either you allow proper instruction or you demonstrate that your alleged technique can perform under actual challenging conditions rather than these elementary target distances." Elena felt her heart rate increase as the confrontation escalated beyond mere disagreement into something approaching public humiliation. She recognized the familiar dynamic of authority figures who could not accept evidence that contradicted their preconceptions. "What kind of demonstration did you have in mind, Colonel?" she asked quietly, though she suspected that any challenge Burke proposed would be designed to expose what he assumed were her fundamental limitations. Burke smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who believed he was about to prove his point decisively. He gestured toward the far end of the range, where targets could be positioned at distances beyond the standard 100-yard recreational shooting setup. "If your unconventional technique is as effective as your initial shot suggests, then you should have no difficulty engaging targets at 300 yards with the same precision," he announced, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone issuing a challenge he was certain would expose his opponent's inadequacies. Torres stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation was taking. 300-yard shots required different ammunition, specialized equipment, and safety considerations that civilian range sessions rarely addressed. "Colonel, perhaps we should consider that 300-yard shooting requires different setup procedures and safety protocols," Torres suggested diplomatically, hoping to provide both parties with a graceful exit from the escalating situation. "The lady claims her technique accommodates her physical limitations effectively," Burke responded dismissively. "Surely those same accommodations would function at extended distances if they possess any legitimate merit." Elena stood silently for a long moment, weighing her options while feeling the weight of multiple gazes focused on her position. The challenge was clearly designed to humiliate her, based on Burke's assumption that her earlier accuracy had been either lucky accident or the result of favorable conditions that would not translate to more demanding circumstances. The elderly gentleman at lane 3 moved closer, his curiosity overcoming his natural reluctance to involve himself in military matters. The young woman at lane 7 had set down her rifle entirely, recognizing that something significant was about to unfold that transcended normal range activities. "Very well, Colonel," Elena said finally, her voice carrying a quiet resignation that Burke interpreted as acknowledgement of defeat. "I will attempt your 300-yard demonstration." Burke's satisfaction was visible as he began organizing the more complex setup required for extended distance shooting. He had maneuvered Elena into a position where her inevitable failure would vindicate his expertise and restore the proper order of military authority over civilian presumption. Elena watched his preparations with growing internal tension, knowing that the demonstration would reveal far more about her background and capabilities than she had ever intended to share during what should have been a simple morning practice session. Torres reluctantly began the process of setting up the 300-yard target system, his movements reflecting the discomfort he felt with the entire situation. Burke supervised the preparation with obvious satisfaction, occasionally glancing back at Elena with the expression of someone who had successfully maneuvered an opponent into an impossible position. The electronic target retrieval system hummed to life, carrying a fresh bullseye target to the distant position that would serve as the stage for Elena's anticipated failure. At 300 yards, the target appeared as little more than a small white square against the earthen backstop, a challenge that would test even experienced military marksmen under ideal conditions. Burke examined Elena's rifle with professional scrutiny, noting its civilian specifications and limitations. The hunting rifle, while well-maintained, lacked the specialized features that military precision shooting typically required for extended distance accuracy. Your equipment is adequate for recreational hunting, but hardly optimized for precision marksmanship at this distance, he observed, his tone suggesting that equipment limitations would provide a convenient explanation for Elena's coming failure. Military marksmen utilize rifles specifically designed for extended range accuracy. Elena nodded politely, though inwardly she felt a familiar calm settling over her consciousness. The challenge ahead demanded the kind of focus that had once been second nature to her, a mental state she had not accessed in years of civilian life. The atmospheric conditions will also present challenges that recreational shooters rarely encounter, Burke continued, gesturing toward the subtle wind indicators positioned along the range. Proper compensation for environmental factors requires training that civilian shooting typically does not address. Torres completed the target setup and returned to the firing line, his expression reflecting hope that cooler heads might yet prevail. The elderly gentleman had moved close enough to observe the proceedings clearly, while the young woman maintained her position near lane 7, her earlier shooting forgotten in favor of watching the unfolding drama. Burke positioned himself where he could observe Elena's technique and target results simultaneously, his anticipation barely concealed beneath his professional demeanor. He had created what he believed was an impossible challenge, one that would finally expose the fundamental inadequacies of Elena's unconventional approach. Elena approached the firing line with measured steps, her rifle held with the casual competence that had characterized her earlier shooting. She knelt behind the shooting bench and began adjusting her position, making the same modifications to standard form that had initially drawn Burke's critical attention. Those same technique flaws will be magnified significantly at extended distance, Burke announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Environmental factors and increased range will expose the fundamental instability of improper shooting positions. Elena settled into her modified stance, feeling the familiar alignment that accommodated the limitations her body had learned to work around. The 300-yard target wavered slightly in her scope, a distant objective that required careful calculation of factors beyond simple marksmanship. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing her breathing to settle into the controlled rhythm that had once been as natural as walking. When she opened them again, her sight picture revealed the tiny target with crystalline clarity, despite the distance and atmospheric interference that Burke expected would overwhelm her capabilities. Proper wind calculation alone requires extensive training and experience, Burke continued, apparently unable to resist providing commentary that would highlight Elena's coming failure. Military snipers spend months learning to read environmental conditions accurately. Elena made minute adjustments to her scope, her movements displaying a familiarity with precision shooting equipment that went beyond recreational experience. The elderly gentleman noticed her practiced efficiency and leaned forward with growing interest. Torres observed the proceedings with increasing unease, recognizing that the situation had evolved beyond simple disagreement into something approaching a formal challenge between military authority and civilian determination. The outcome would establish precedents that might affect future interactions between base personnel and civilian range users. Elena took her first sighting shot, the rifle's report echoing across the extended range with authority that seemed different from her earlier recreational shooting. Through the spotting scope, Burke watched the bullet impact near the target's edge, a result he interpreted as confirmation of his predictions about her technique's inadequacy at distance. As expected, Burke announced with obvious satisfaction, his voice carrying across the range for all to hear. Extended distance exposes the fundamental weaknesses of improper technique. That shot placement demonstrates exactly why military standards exist. Elena remained motionless behind her rifle, studying the impact point through her scope with the analytical focus of someone gathering critical data rather than experiencing disappointment. The shot had struck approximately 8 inches left and 4 inches low, providing her with precise information about wind conditions and bullet drop at this distance. Torres examined the target through the spotting scope, noting the impact location while trying to maintain diplomatic neutrality in an increasingly uncomfortable situation. The other observers waited expectantly for Elena's response to what appeared to be confirmation of Burke's superior knowledge. "Would you like to concede the demonstration now? Or shall we continue with additional shots that will only further illustrate the point?" Burke asked, his tone offering what he considered generous opportunity for Elena to surrender with minimal additional embarrassment. Elena made subtle adjustments to her scope settings, her movements displaying the methodical precision of someone making calculated corrections rather than random attempts at improvement. Her breathing remained controlled, and her posture showed no signs of the frustration or defeat that Burke expected to observe. "I would like to fire one more shot, if that is acceptable," she replied quietly, her voice maintaining the same respectful tone she had used throughout the morning despite the increasingly hostile circumstances. Burke gestured magnanimously, clearly confident that additional attempts would only reinforce his point about the superiority of proper military training over civilian improvisation. He positioned himself to observe both Elena's technique and the target results, anticipating the final proof of his expertise. The wind indicators along the range showed a slight shift in direction since Elena's first shot, a subtle change that recreational shooters typically failed to notice or compensate for effectively. Burke noted the atmospheric variation with professional satisfaction, knowing that such factors would further complicate Elena's already inadequate shooting position. Elena observed the same wind change through her scope, reading the environmental conditions with an accuracy that reflected extensive experience with precision shooting under varying circumstances. She made additional minute adjustments to her point of aim, compensating for both the observed wind shift and the data provided by her previous shot. "Environmental factors are constantly changing," Burke observed, continuing his instructional commentary. "Military marksmen learn to adapt continuously rather than relying on single data points from previous shots." The elderly gentleman moved closer to the spotting scope position, his curiosity overcoming any reluctance to involve himself in the confrontation. The young woman at Lane 7 had abandoned her equipment entirely, drawn by the drama unfolding at the far end of the range. Elena settled into her firing position with renewed focus, her modified stance accommodating her physical limitations while providing the stability necessary for precision shooting. The familiar comfort of controlled breathing and steady aim helped center her consciousness despite the unwanted scrutiny and pressure. Burke watched her preparations with growing confidence, certain that her second attempt would provide even more conclusive evidence of technique failure under challenging conditions. He had successfully maneuvered her into a demonstration that would vindicate his expertise and restore proper respect for military authority. Torres stood ready to observe the shot results, hoping privately that Elena might perform well enough to avoid complete humiliation while recognizing that Burke's expectations seemed well-founded given the challenging distance and conditions. Elena's finger found the trigger with practiced precision, applying the steady pressure that would send her second round toward the distant target. The crosshairs settled naturally on her chosen point of aim, adjusted for the wind and distance factors she had calculated based on her previous shot and environmental observation. The rifle fired with authority that seemed to resonate differently across the range, carrying a finality that suggested something significant was about to be revealed. Burke leaned forward to observe the target results through the spotting scope, anticipating the confirmation of Elena's technical inadequacy that would conclude the demonstration in his favor. Burke adjusted the spotting scope focus and froze completely, his confident expression dissolving into confusion as he stared at the distant target. The second shot had struck dead center in the bullseye, creating a perfect hole that seemed to mock every assumption he had made about Elena's capabilities. "That cannot be correct," he muttered, adjusting the scope focus repeatedly as if the optical equipment might be deceiving him. He stepped back from the spotting scope, then returned to examine the target again, his professional composure cracking visibly. Torres moved to the spotting scope and confirmed what Burke had observed, his own surprise evident in his careful silence. The elderly gentleman requested a look, and his low whistle of appreciation carried clearly across the range when he saw the precision of Elena's shot placement. Burke's mind raced to find explanations that would preserve his worldview. Lucky accident, he declared, though his voice lacked the conviction that had characterized his earlier pronouncements. Environmental conditions shifted favorably at the moment of trigger pull. Elena remained in her firing position, though she had lifted her head from the scope to observe Burke's reaction. She recognized the expression of someone whose fundamental beliefs were being challenged by undeniable evidence, a cognitive dissonance that created visible stress. The young woman from Lane 7 approached the group, drawn by the obvious drama surrounding the target results. When she looked through the spotting scope, her sharp intake of breath confirmed what the others had witnessed. Burke began examining Elena's rifle with renewed intensity, searching for explanations in the equipment that might account for precision he had not anticipated. The weapon remained unremarkable, a standard hunting rifle without specialized features that would enable extraordinary accuracy. "Ma'am, what type of ammunition are you using?" Burke demanded, his tone suggesting that specialized rounds might explain the unexpected results. "Military precision requires match-grade components that civilian shooters rarely utilize. Standard hunting ammunition," Elena replied quietly, her voice carrying none of the triumph that Burke expected from someone who had just proved him wrong so decisively. "Factory loaded, nothing special." Burke's investigation of Elena's equipment became increasingly desperate as he sought technical explanations for her performance. He examined her scope mounts, checked her rifle's action, and even inspected her shooting mat for features that might provide unfair advantage. Torres observed Burke's growing agitation with professional concern, recognizing the signs of an officer whose authority had been undermined in ways that threatened his self-perception. The situation was evolving beyond simple disagreement into something that might require careful management. Elena finally rose from her shooting position, her movements displaying the controlled economy that had characterized her presence throughout the morning. As she stood, her loose jacket shifted slightly, revealing glimpses of scarred tissue along her left shoulder that she quickly covered. Burke noticed the brief exposure, and his expression changed from confusion to something approaching suspicion. The scars appeared extensive, suggesting trauma that went beyond typical civilian injuries or recreational accidents. "Those are significant injuries," he observed, his voice taking on the investigative tone of someone pursuing a new line of inquiry. "What type of accident caused such extensive damage?" Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, her composure showing the first signs of strain since the confrontation began. She adjusted her jacket to ensure complete coverage of the scarred area, her movements protective and automatic. "An old injury," she replied, her voice maintaining its respectful tone despite the personal nature of Burke's questioning. "It happened quite some time ago." Burke studied Elena with renewed intensity, his professional instincts suggesting that ordinary civilian injuries rarely produce the type of scarring he had glimpsed. The precision of her shooting, combined with the evidence of significant trauma, began forming patterns in his mind that challenged his initial assumptions about her background. The atmosphere on the range had shifted dramatically from Burke's confident demonstration of superior knowledge to something approaching interrogation as he pursued answers that might explain Elena's unexpected capabilities. The other observers sensed the change, recognizing that the morning's events had revealed more than anyone had anticipated. Elena felt the familiar weight of unwanted scrutiny focused on aspects of her life that she had worked carefully to keep private. The peaceful anonymity of civilian range sessions was dissolving under Burke's persistent investigation into matters she preferred to leave undiscussed. Burke's persistence in examining her equipment and questioning her background finally pushed Elena beyond her carefully maintained composure. She set her rifle down with deliberate precision and turned to face him directly, her demeanor shifting from defensive civilian to something that carried unmistakable authority. "Colonel Burke," she said, her voice taking on a tone that made Torres straighten instinctively. "You have spent this morning questioning my technique, dismissing my explanations, and now interrogating me about personal matters that are none of your concern. Burke stepped back slightly, recognizing a fundamental change in Elena's presence that he could not immediately identify. The quiet civilian woman who had deferred to his authority throughout the morning had been replaced by someone who projected confidence and command in ways that seemed familiar yet unexpected. I am simply trying to understand how someone with obvious technical deficiencies managed to achieve results that contradict established principles, Burke replied, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Elena reached for the zipper of her jacket, her movements deliberate and purposeful. As she pulled the fabric aside, extensive scarring became visible along her left shoulder and upper arm, creating patterns that spoke of serious trauma and multiple surgical interventions. These scars are from an improvised explosive device that detonated during my third deployment in Afghanistan, she said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting professional history rather than personal tragedy. The blast damaged nerve pathways and restricted range of motion in ways that required adaptation of standard shooting positions. Burke's expression transformed from skepticism to growing recognition as Elena continued her revelation. Torres moved closer, his professional instincts recognizing the shift in dynamics that was occurring before his eyes. I served as a sniper with the Army's 1st Battalion, 24th Infantry Regiment for 8 years. Elena continued, her civilian facade dissolving completely. My modified shooting position accommodates permanent physical limitations while maintaining the precision that kept my unit alive during 47 confirmed combat engagements. The elderly gentleman and young woman from the other lanes had moved close enough to hear Elena's words clearly, their expressions reflecting the shock of discovering that the quiet civilian they had observed all morning possessed a military background that dwarfed Burke's peacetime experience. Burke struggled to process the information that was reshaping everything he thought he understood about the morning's events. Elena's exceptional shooting, her calm under pressure, and her knowledge of equipment suddenly made sense within the context of combat experience that exceeded his own. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, Elena said, providing the identification that Burke's questioning had demanded. Honorably discharged after medical evaluation determined that my injuries precluded continued active duty, though my shooting capabilities remained intact. Torres recognized the unit designation and its reputation, his expression reflecting the respect that Elena's service record commanded. The 1st Battalion 24th Infantry had seen extensive combat during the heaviest fighting in Afghanistan, producing soldiers whose skills were legendary within military circles. Burke found himself in the unprecedented position of having challenged and dismissed someone whose combat experience and proven capabilities far exceeded his own administrative career. The morning's confident assertions about proper technique and military superiority had been directed at a soldier whose battlefield accomplishments made his peacetime credentials appear insignificant. "Ma'am, I had no knowledge of your service record," Burke said, his voice taking on the respectful tone that Elena's revelation demanded. "Your shooting technique obviously reflects adaptations developed under circumstances that I have not experienced." Elena adjusted her jacket to cover the scars once again, her movements suggesting that the revelation had been necessary but unwelcome. The peaceful anonymity she had maintained for years had been destroyed by Burke's persistent questioning and her own unwillingness to continue accepting undeserved criticism. "My technique works because it was developed in situations where failure meant death, not poor scores on recreational targets," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone whose credentials had been earned under the most demanding circumstances possible. The range had fallen completely silent except for the distant sounds of base operations, as everyone present absorbed the implications of Elena's revealed identity and service history. Burke's confident morning of instruction had been transformed into a lesson about assumptions and the dangers of judging capabilities based on appearances. The weight of Elena's revelation settled over the range like a heavy blanket, transforming the entire atmosphere from Burke's confident demonstration into something approaching a military tribunal, where he found himself as the accused rather than the authority figure. "Staff Sergeant," "I owe you a formal apology," Burke said, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone whose professional pride was colliding with undeniable evidence of his error. "Your service record and combat experience clearly supersede my peacetime administrative background." Elena studied Burke's face, recognizing the struggle between his damaged ego and his genuine respect for military service. She had encountered similar reactions before, though rarely in circumstances where her identity had been revealed so dramatically. Torres stepped forward, his own military bearing reflecting the respect that Elena's service record commanded. "Ma'am, the 1st Battalion 24th saw some of the heaviest fighting in the Helmand Province. Your unit's reputation preceded you even among Marines." The elderly gentleman approached with obvious reverence, his earlier curiosity replaced by the deference that veterans typically showed to those who had served in combat roles. "I served in Vietnam," he said quietly. "Different war, same respect for those who carry the real burden." Elena acknowledged his words with a slight nod, recognizing the bond that existed between those who had experienced combat regardless of the specific conflict or era. The young woman from Lane 7 remained silent, clearly overwhelmed by the revelation that the quiet civilian she had observed possessed such extraordinary background. Burke's mind raced to reconstruct the morning's events through the lens of Elena's revealed identity. Every criticism he had offered, every dismissive comment about her technique, every assumption about her limitations had been directed at someone whose credentials made his own career appear insignificant by comparison. "Your shooting modifications represent legitimate combat adaptations," he admitted, his voice reflecting the difficulty of acknowledging that his textbook knowledge had been inadequate to recognize battlefield-proven techniques. Military doctrine should account for such innovations developed under actual combat conditions. Elena felt no satisfaction in Burke's forced recognition, understanding that his embarrassment served no productive purpose. She had spent years learning to navigate civilian life without relying on her military background for respect or credibility, preferring the anonymity that allowed her to exist without constant reference to her service. "Colonel, your concern for proper technique comes from genuine dedication to military excellence," she replied, offering Burke an opportunity to salvage some dignity from the situation. Different experiences produce different solutions to the same fundamental challenges. Torres observed the exchange with professional appreciation for Elena's gracious handling of Burke's predicament. Her willingness to minimize his embarrassment demonstrated the kind of leadership that effective military service often produced, even among those who no longer wore the uniform. Burke struggled with the cognitive dissonance of having spent the morning lecturing someone whose practical experience far exceeded his theoretical knowledge. The confident authority he had projected throughout his career suddenly felt hollow when measured against Elena's proven capabilities under the most demanding circumstances. "Ma'am, would you be willing to share some of your adaptations with our training programs?" he asked, his tone reflecting genuine interest in learning rather than his earlier condescending instruction. "Your combat modifications might benefit current personnel facing similar physical challenges." Elena considered the request carefully, weighing her desire for continued anonymity against the potential value of sharing techniques that had been developed through necessity and refined under life-threatening conditions. Her modifications represented solutions to problems that other injured veterans might face. "I would prefer to avoid formal involvement with base training programs," she replied diplomatically. "However, I would be willing to discuss specific techniques with individual personnel who might benefit from alternative approaches." The compromise satisfied Burke's need to extract something constructive from the morning's events while respecting Elena's obvious preference for maintaining distance from official military activities. Torres nodded approvingly, recognizing a solution that honored both parties' legitimate concerns. Burke examined Elena's target one final time through the spotting scope, seeing the precise shot placement through entirely different eyes. What had appeared to be lucky accident now revealed itself as the natural result of skills honed through years of combat experience and refined through necessity. The range atmosphere had transformed completely from the confident instruction session Burke had initiated to a respectful acknowledgement of Elena's superior credentials and experience. The other shooters observed the resolution with obvious fascination, having witnessed an educational encounter that none of them would soon forget. In the weeks that followed, the story of Elena's revelation spread quietly through the base community, creating a subtle shift in how military personnel viewed the civilian shooters who shared their facilities. Burke had learned a lesson about assumptions that would influence his leadership style for the remainder of his career. Elena returned to her regular Tuesday and Thursday shooting sessions, though the peaceful anonymity she had once enjoyed was forever changed. Torres greeted her with genuine respect, and other range users approached her with the deference that her service record commanded, though she continued to prefer quiet practice over conversation. Burke made a point of visiting the range during Elena's sessions, not to provide unwanted instruction, but to observe techniques that his textbook knowledge had failed to recognize. He had begun incorporating her adaptive modifications into training programs for injured personnel, always crediting the innovations to field experience rather than identifying Elena specifically. The elderly Vietnam veteran became a regular companion during Elena's range time, finding comfort in the presence of someone who understood the weight that combat service could carry long after the uniform was retired. Their conversations remained brief, but carried the depth that shared experience provided. The young woman from Lane 7 had transformed her own shooting approach, abandoning the rigid textbook positions that had frustrated her in favor of modifications that accommodated her natural build and comfort. Elena occasionally offered quiet suggestions, sharing knowledge without the condescending authority that had characterized Burke's earlier instruction. Torres had implemented policy changes that emphasized respect for all range users regardless of their apparent experience level, understanding that appearances could be deceiving in ways that his morning with Elena had demonstrated conclusively. The civilian shooting sessions became more collaborative, with military personnel learning alongside recreational shooters. Elena's target from that memorable morning had been preserved in Burke's office, serving as a permanent reminder of the dangers of judging capabilities based on assumptions. The precise shot placement represented more than marksmanship excellence. It symbolized the respect that experience deserved regardless of its source. Burke's leadership style evolved to incorporate Elena's lesson about listening before instructing, observing before criticizing, and understanding that effective techniques could emerge from circumstances that textbook training had never addressed. His subordinates noticed the change, though few understood its origin. The range community had developed an informal understanding that Elena's presence represented something special, a connection to military service that demanded respect even when her civilian clothing suggested otherwise. New users learned quickly that quiet competence often concealed extraordinary backgrounds. Elena found unexpected satisfaction in sharing her knowledge with those who approached her respectfully, understanding that her techniques might help other veterans adapting to injuries or civilians seeking to improve their capabilities. The teaching relationship developed naturally, without the formal structure that would have compromised her desired anonymity. Burke eventually requested a private conversation with Elena, seeking to understand how his peacetime military experience might better serve personnel who would face actual combat conditions. Their discussion lasted several hours, covering topics that extended far beyond shooting techniques to include leadership under pressure and the reality of battlefield decision-making. The transformation extended beyond the shooting range to other base interactions, as word spread about the civilian woman whose quiet competence had educated a colonel about the dangers of assumptions. Military personnel began approaching civilian interactions with greater humility and respect for hidden experience. Elena's morning practice sessions became a symbol of something larger than marksmanship, representing the ongoing service that veterans provided simply by sharing their experience with those still learning. Burke's confident instruction had been replaced by collaborative learning that benefited everyone involved. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about your favorite moment or character Or tell us about someone you know who showed hidden strength when others underestimated them. The range continued its regular operations, but the atmosphere had permanently changed from Burke's hierarchical instruction to Elena's quiet demonstration that respect must be earned through understanding rather than demanded through rank. The lesson resonated throughout the base community, creating lasting improvements in how experience was valued regardless of its source.